Welcome, everyone. We're just letting everybody in to the talk right now. Thank you for joining us. This is Building a Budget, Financial Basics for Research Proposals. I'm Laura Sheehan. I'm Manager of Research Administration for the Department of Family Medicine at UCLA. I've got about 23 years of academic research administration experience at USC and at UCLA. Our department brings in about $10 million a year, and we consistently rank in the top 10 nationwide for federal funding. So hopefully you find what I have to say helpful, and we'll go from there. I do want to ask Enrique to maybe put the poll up now while I'm doing the basic housekeeping stuff. This will be recorded. It is going to be shared as well as the slides afterwards. I do want to thank Chips for inviting me. Here are the objectives. Hopefully you've been here. You're here because you've already read them and you're like, oh yeah, this is totally something I want to learn about. So I won't go through each of them line by line, but these are what we're hoping to accomplish today during our talk. I did give a talk for Chips back in fall. It's not a prerequisite, so don't worry if you weren't there. But if you were, and you came back for more, well, welcome back. There are a few slides that might look vaguely familiar. I did copy a couple of my graphics from the previous talk. I always tell people don't reinvent the wheel, and I like to practice what I preach. So you might see a few things that look familiar, but 95% of this talk is new material. So if you did attend in September, don't worry, this is going to build on what we learned before. So Enrique, did you get a chance to put that poll up? If not, get it up when you can. We can always do it later, but it's a good idea to get a feel for who's in the room. All right, I'm going to move on while they get there. Oh, there it is. Okay, awesome. So yeah, go ahead and take a minute there to let us know who you are, what your role is. And so then I can try to tailor my talk slightly to whoever's in the room the most. While people are answering that, let me move on to just the basics of what is a budget. This is a compilation of a couple of people's definitions of it, but one of the areas I wanted to highlight in particular was that cost should be derived from the project description. So really, when you're trying to come up with how to create your budget, you really want to focus on what are you trying to achieve and how is this money going to help you achieve that. Now, I wish it was as easy as that. There are a lot of formatting and guidelines and templates and allowables and unallowables and indirects and all sorts of other things that you need to understand in order to be in compliance with policy. So we are going to get into a little bit of that nitty-gritty. But hopefully you have a contractor grant expert at your site whose job it is, a pre-award person whose job it is to know this stuff inside and out. So at the end of this course, we want you to be budget literate and understand how the budget will shape the development of your project. But we don't expect you to be budget experts at the end, unless you're on this call and you are a budget expert. So let's take a look at those poll results and see what we got here. Mostly researchers and research staff. We do have about a quarter of you are administrators. And then we've got some fund managers. Great. Most of you are at academic institutions. So that's good to know. All right. Thank you for participating in that. And I will move on. Okay. So whatever the budget is that you're putting together, there are 5 cost principles that around the world, everybody will want to hold you to. And these are also what you're going to be graded on. So when you are submitting a proposal, basically you're trying to convince the sponsors that you know what you're talking about. What you're asking for is what you should be asking for. And these are the areas that they're going to grade you on in order to determine that. So first of all, it has to be allowable. And you're going to read those guidelines and you're going to know if there's anything in particular that this sponsor is not interested in funding. They will tell you right off the bat, oh, don't budget for travel, for example. So you're going to make sure that you're in compliance with that. You also want to make sure that your costs are allocable. So what exactly does that mean? That means it's relevant to this specific project, not necessarily to you or to your research as a whole. To this particular project, it is required. It needs to be reasonable. Would a jury of your peers look at the dollar amount that you've associated with this particular item and say, yeah, that seems about right? Is it necessary? Do you really need it? It might be nice to have, but do you really need it in order to carry out the work? If not, maybe don't include it. And then last but not least is that it should be consistently applied. So if you go to the NIH and say, I'm doing this project, I'm going to be dedicating 20% effort and I need $10,000 for rent. And then you turn around and you go to like RWJF and you say, I'm going to be dedicating 20% effort and I need $2,000 for rent. That's problematic. That is a huge audit flag. You are not supposed to do that. That's not allowable. If a sponsor found out that you were doing that, they would not want to fund you in the future. If you have a cost, it has to be fairly applied no matter what the funding source is. Now, if there are maximums or unallowable items, you're not even allowed to include rent, that's a separate matter. But we're talking about ones for which that doesn't apply. All right. Oh, I forgot to say about questions. So if you have questions, please type them into the chat. There are going to be moments throughout my talk where I will have time to take questions. There are little breaks, not breaks, but activities throughout, at which time you can unmute if you would prefer rather than typing into the chat. And if I can get through these quick enough, hopefully we'll have time for a Q&A at the end. But as you have questions, as they come up, type them into the chat. And Elena and Enrique, if you see any that you think are particularly important, yes, please interrupt me and get me to stop talking and I will take a look at that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the different types of budgets, because you're going to need to understand this in order to create one. So we have two main types. There's cost reimbursement, and then there's going to be a firm fixed, either a firm fixed price or a firm fixed rate. But the first one, cost reimbursement, this is the most common one that you're going to see. It means that you are going to have a line item budget where you have personnel and salaries and travel and all the different individual items. And then if it gets awarded, you are going to be, not you, but your department or your institution will invoice based on what costs you actually incurred. So as you do effort and you charge January's salary or payroll, you will incur those costs and then you will invoice the sponsor and you will get that money back. So as you spend down all the way up until you run out of money or until the project ends. If you come to the end of your project and you haven't spent it in full, any dollars left over go back to the sponsor. The other type of budget is a firm fixed one. It's either based on a rate, like the number of units performed, the number of lab tests that you processed, or the number of participants that you enrolled. There's going to be a specific dollar amount tied to whatever that unit is, and you are going to get that dollar amount based off of that unit, no matter what you spend it on. So in order to come up with the fixed price, you have to have a budget to say, this is how we came up with it. Let's say $5,000 per participant enrolled. Here's how we came up with that 5,000. But once you've done that and you're performing the work, you enroll X number of patients, it's X times 5,000, and that's what you get. You don't even have to spend it on what you said you were going to spend it on. You should, but you don't necessarily have to. Any money left over, it's yours to keep because you delivered what you said you were going to deliver, got the dollar amount that was agreed upon between two parties, and that's the way it is. Every now and then you will have a budget that has a combination of these two, there might be a firm fixed amount based off of milestones, but a separate section for cost reimbursement, like maybe travel. They'll say if you want to go to a conference to present research, you can invoice us your actual costs on that. So every now and then it's split, but for the most part, it's one or the other. And for the most part, these bottom two, that's your clinical trial type stuff. Now, I wish I had time to go into, actually, I don't wish. I don't have time, nor do I want to go into how to build a clinical trial budget during today's course. I'm going to spend a grand total of one slide on that, which is the next slide. The rest of this talk is really going to be focused on this top box, which is the most common one anyway. And it's also often when you are doing a clinical trial, a lot of times the budget is fixed already. You're just one of many sites, and they already have the dollar per patient figured out, and you're just participating in it. Every now and then you might be creating your own, but it's its own separate beast, and there should be something at your institution that will help walk you through how to build those. So having said that, let's just take a quick look at it so you understand what it is. In this particular case, this is a fixed price per participant. And they looked at it and said, what are all the things that we need to do? We have to do an informed consent, we have to do a blood draw, etc. They quantified it regarding how many hours would it take the nurse to do it, how many hours would it take the investigator to do it, times their salary, whatnot, and they came up with this dollar amount. Every patient enrolled in the study, we should get $5,327 for. And that's how that functions. So now that you know that, let's go back to our the rest of our budgets here, and we'll do a couple more basics, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. I do want to explain the difference between a budget period and a project period, because it's going to come up a lot. So let's take a look at this one as an example. It looks like there's budget period 1 is like a year, budget period 2 is a year, and this budget period 3 is 6 months, let's say. You'll often hear people say, oh, year 1 of the study or year 2 of the study. But that gets problematic if your year 2 is only 6 months. It can get confusing. So that's why we say budget period instead of year, although we say year all the time as well. But that's the difference there. And then the period of performance, or the project period, is from the very beginning of your first budget period to the very end of your last budget period. That all together is your project period. So there is a difference between budget period and project period. Get in the habit of not using them interchangeably because they do have different definitions. All right. While our brains are fresh and we're not 90 minutes into a 90-minute talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about direct versus indirect, because this is confusing and I always get a ton of questions about it. So let's kind of talk a little bit about what exactly is that. So direct cost is what you think of when you have a study. This is the cost that you're only going to incur if you get the project funded. It's the effort that is directly attributable to the project. Participant incentives. It's basically all the stuff that you need to function or to carry out the research that's being proposed. Indirect costs, on the other hand, are expenses involved with maintaining and running an institution. So whether you get this project funded or not, you probably will still have those costs that have to be covered. I also want to point out that IDC overhead cost, F&A, facility administrative costs, and indirect costs are all the same thing. We have like 6 different names for the same thing. IDC, F&A, overhead, it all means these expenses that are involved with maintaining the institution. And what it is that we usually, what institutions do, will say, in addition to whatever dollar amount you're asking for, we're going to ask for a percentage on top of that to help us cover these costs. So it's going to cover things like the building that you're in. If you're on campus, that building needs to be maintained. It's going to cover that. Utilities. If there's any central services, like human resources, accounts payable, Office of Contract and Grant Administration, If your department has like a finance person that helps everybody with their, all of that gets paid for by indirect costs, but you don't budget for them in your budget. It's on top of the direct costs that you're asking for. So how does that get budgeted? There's an indirect cost rate, which is a set percentage. It is different depending on your institution. It's going to be a percentage of your direct cost, but it's usually the percentage of your modified direct cost total. And what do I mean by modified? We'll get into in a minute, but some things are going to be exempt, like you can't, incur overhead on them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Usually, most institutions have more than one rate, especially if you're at a big academic institution like most of us are. So take a look at it. There's going to be an on-campus rate for research and an off-campus rate for instruction. If you are at a small nonprofit and you don't have a federally approved F&A rate agreement, you're allowed to use what they call the de minimis rate, which is 10%. And there's a link here when we send out the slides. If you know that your institution doesn't have one, that's going to be the one that you should use if you're at a nonprofit. Be aware that some sponsors will restrict indirect costs or completely unallow them entirely. If that is either of those scenarios is the case, you're going to want to do a full stop and don't proceed any further until you confirm that you can actually accept this award. Sometimes they'll say, we don't allow overhead. And then you spend all this time submitting your proposal, and then you get the award, and then you submit it to your contracting grant office, and they're like, we can't accept this. We have to charge overhead. They don't have an overhead, exception at our institution. They charge so-and-so overhead. Why won't they let you charge overhead? And now all of a sudden you either have to cut your budget to allocate some of it towards overhead or not accept the award at all. Neither of those scenarios are good, so make sure that you can proceed if that happens. Okay, I'm just checking to see how I'm doing on my time, and I am good. All right, so an example of what an F&A rate agreement looks like. Here's UCLA's. This is just one of like 5 pages, and you can see there's a bunch of different rates. We've got on campus for organized research versus off campus for organized research. There's separate ones for instruction. For me, I'm located off campus, and most of the work I do is research. It's not necessarily instruction or a public service or something else. And so my rate is going to be this 26%. But I also need to pay attention to the period. In this particular case, this is only valid through 2019. So now I got to figure out, well, where's 2023? We don't have it. It looks like on ours, it's until amended, I just used the 2019 rates. All right, good to know. And then I need to figure out, well, what's the base? Remember I said it's like modified total cost. Down here, it's going to tell you what does that modification mean? In this case, it's easier to look at what it excludes rather than what it includes, because it includes everything except these items down here. The ones that are most common are going to be equipment. Most people's F&A rate agreements are going to not allow you to charge overhead on equipment. Another big one is if you have a grad student and you have to cover a portion of their tuition, can't charge overhead on that. And the last one is the most common, and that is subawards. It's saying that you can charge indirect costs on a subaward, but not beyond 25,000. Once you reach the 25,000, anything beyond that cannot incur overhead. So we're going to go into that a little bit later when we dig into subawards, but I want to take a moment to let you test your skills. Go to Google, see if you can find your institution's indirect cost rate agreement right now. Find it, take a look at it, see if you can figure out what your rate is, what the base is, effective dates, all of that. If you know you don't have one, maybe Google the federal de minimis rate and look at that. And in the meantime, I'm going to open the floor for any questions anybody has up to now while everybody does this. Just going to look at the chat here. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for all the introductions in the chat. I don't see any questions, so hopefully you are all looking for your rate and taking a look at it and getting familiar with it. Again, you don't need to be an expert in it, but it's really going to help you to know how it works, especially if there are limits onto it, or if you are on a tight budget and you need to know how close you are to the maximum. Okay. So mosey on back here. If you're still looking for it, feel free to just listen with one ear while I move on. This slide might be familiar to those of you who had joined me in the fall. This is the research project process from inception of idea all the way to closeout. Last year's talk focused on that first line. We are focused today just on budgets. And if I were to ask you, where in this process do you develop your budget? The majority of you would probably say right here, and you would not be wrong. That is correct. The majority of your budget is going to be developed right there in that phase. But it's really important to know that your budget will be shaped starting here and even here. And so you need to start thinking about money early on. And the reason why is because, as Joel Gray and Liza Minnelli said, money makes the world go round. And it is going to affect what you are able to do. The scope of your work is going to be affected depending on how much it costs. So let's start at the very beginning and at the idea phase, and how the budget can be affected even that early on. All right, so, oh, and I see people are sharing their indirect cost rate, 4% and 30. Wow, that's really low. I'm curious to know, does anybody here have an overhead cost rate that they found that was more than 50%? And if so, can you share it? That means that for every dollar you're getting, more than 50 cents you have to ask for to go towards the university. Yep, we got 56%, 60. I'm curious to know what the highest is. The highest I've ever seen was 90%, which is crazy. All right, so quite a bit. Yes, 60. Yeah, there's a big difference depending on what institution you're at. So we can chat about that more when we have more time. But all right, so you're in the idea phase. This slide is somewhat familiar to you. I tell you that reviewers are going to be judging you on significance, innovation, and who and the team that you're proposing to carry out the research. And they're looking for these 3 questions: why, how, and who. Why is this significant? Why are you passionate about it? Why should the sponsors care about what you're researching? Innovation, how is this different? And then building your team. Who is going to be in charge of it? Why are they the best person in the world to do it? Out of these 3 things that you're figuring out during your idea phase, the one that's going to have the biggest impact on your budget and thinking about it is going to be this last one here, building your team. So let's talk a little bit about that and how it can shape the budget before we move on. So first things first, figure out who's already on your team. Take roll. Who's going to be doing what is their role, and then take a look at it with a critical eye and say, if I was a reviewer, what would I say we're missing? Is there, or is anybody on your team not actually available? They might be perfect, but they only had 10% availability, and you have some, really big tasks you need them to do that's more like 30%. Okay, maybe you need to expand your team to take some of those responsibilities off of that person's plate, or maybe go with a different investigator altogether. You also want to think about your, if there's guidelines that your sponsor wants to see you involving multiple, maybe they want it to be interdisciplinary, or they want you to have a community partnership. Think about that. And then I also remind people, don't forget about the administrative burden. A lot of people are thinking, when they think about building their team, they're looking at co-investigators, and they forget about all of the administrative burden that comes along with putting together a research project and the time it takes to carry that out. So some things to think about when you're in the idea phase is your proposal going to have a lot of events or a really big event? Event coordination is a real thing. It takes effort and time. is your co-investigator faculty member going to be the one doing it? Or do you maybe need to hire a non-key personnel person to handle it? If you are going to be buying a lot of stuff or reimbursing a bunch of people, that again comes with its own administrative burden. Allow for that. A lot of scheduling. Maybe you need to hire a research assistant to help out with that. Are you sending out 10,000 questionnaires via email or via snail mail to participants? That's going to take some coordination. Is the PI going to do that, or are you going to have a research assistant or a project coordinator handle that? So if any of these are in there, think about the administrative burden and how you can make sure you have somebody on your team that can help with that. So let's say you look at it and you're missing somebody. You need more admin support, or you need to reach out to another co-investigator to beef up an area of expertise that you are weak in. So now you need to figure out who are those partners going to be. So are they going to be internal, or are they going to be external? Internal could be within your unit, in your department. It could be interdisciplinary in another school. If that's the case, just make sure that their dean or their chair is all right with it, because they are going to probably have to sign off on the internal paperwork. Do they not exist yet, but you're going to hire somebody in that position? If that's the case, you might want to reach out to HR to find out what title are you allowed to hire somebody under for the type of work you want them to do. And then what's the general salary range and benefit rate? How long does it take to hire somebody? Do I have to start working on it now in terms of like writing a job description? These are all things you should be thinking about fairly early on. Let's say it's not internal, you need to find somebody outside. If that's the case, they're going to fall into one of these 4 categories. Either it's going to be a sub-award, also called a sub-recipient or a sub-site. They're going to be a consultant or a contractor. They're going to be a vendor or an other significant contributor. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. A sub-award, if you have somebody who is going to be carrying out an intellectually significant portion of the award, they should probably be listed as a co-investigator, and their budget should be a sub-award. If they fit any of these definitions here, they're going to co-author, are they going to use the funds to carry out a public purpose? Are they going to have a detailed line item budget? If the answers to any of these are yes, then it's likely sub-award is the route you want to go in terms of bringing them on to your team. Let's say it's more, this person is going to be providing more of like advisory positions, or it's a fee for service, or if it's a flat rate. This is more of a procurement relationship, and you're going to want to list them as a consultant. I will say vendors, consultants are considered vendors basically, but not all vendors are consultants. And the difference here is that usually a vendor who's not a consultant is not providing any advisory capacity. They are providing a good or service within their normal operation to lots of different people. So that's kind of the difference there. And then this last one is other significant contributors. Basically, the bottom line is they don't get paid. They're not committing a specified measurable effort. They're just kind of there to like maybe mentor a little bit, provide some guidance, participate in a call here and there. But they're not going to be listed as having any effort that they're getting paid for. This is mostly an NIH title. The nice thing about having this one is it allows you to include their biosketch if they're listed here, but you don't have to include them in the budget. Otherwise, you would not be able to have their biosketch. And if you want to brag about how amazing they are, you want to include their biosketch to improve your impress your reviewers. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail about subawards and all of that later, but just wanted to, in the idea phase, you're thinking about, oh, how is this going to affect my budget down the road? So internal partners are usually pretty easy to sort out because you know how to find their salary. You know what like required costs are included, like are their overhead rates. External partners are not necessarily as easy to figure out how much it's going to cost you. So you need to allow for extra time. You have to communicate to that subaward to get their information. Maybe find out what their salary is so that you can figure out, can I afford putting them on at 15% effort if they are, getting paid $300,000 a year? Or do I want to maybe have them on for 8% effort? You also have to have room in your budget for F&A, overhead, indirect costs. They are going to have to charge their rate unless there's a sponsor, restriction on it. So you have to have room in the budget for that. Consultants, you're going to have to justify it in your budget justification, the dollar amount. We'll get into that a little bit later on the consultants page, but you might want to get more than one bid or an understanding of how much per hour is reasonable for your area or for that type of expertise to make sure that you're not being bamboozled. And again, OSCs don't have any costs associated, so they're free. I do see a lot of people saying, oh my gosh, subawards are such a pain. You got to get like their authorized official to sign off. There's like all this justification and paperwork. It's going to take me forever. The answer is yeah, it does take time in the proposal phase. But if you're thinking it's easier to set it up as a subaward instead of a consultant, you are just kicking a can down the road. Because once you get it awarded, now you have a consultant. And if you've ever had to try to get a consultant paid, especially here at UCLA, you will know it is not easy. Our, how-to page is like 15 pages on how to get a consultant into the system and paid and prove the reasonableness. So yeah, subawards take more time during the proposal, but consultants take more time after it gets awarded. So think about that before you make a decision which way to go. All right, so before we move on to the next section, which is the sponsor and finding funding, are there any questions or concerns about how the budget will shape you in the idea phase? If so, feel free to unmute or type it into the chat. All right, then we are going to move on. So now you got to find the money. You're going to look at different sponsors. There's a couple different sponsor types. You've got internal, that is within your institution. Usually these are small budgets that you get really quick. There's simple rules, there's no overhead. You usually don't even have to go to your office of contracts and grants to get it. You do still need to create a budget for it, but they're pretty straightforward. Pilot funding usually. Now you got your meat and potatoes, government funding. So usually this is your big ticket money. It takes forever to get here. The rules are usually pretty complex, but they're also standardized. It's the same, no matter what group you're with at the NIH, most of them have very similar rules and restrictions and expectations. And the indirect cost rates, they're going to be standard. They will be in line with the federal guidelines with some rare exceptions. Then you've got your private nonprofit. That's the second most common type. And it is all over the place. They will have all sorts of weird templates and weird IDC rules about, only allowing 4% overhead or whatnot, or only allowing overhead on certain items. It'll really vary. So you have to read those guidelines to know. And then your for-profit. This is the biggest red flag. If you're working with a pharmaceutical or a for-profit business, be aware that there will be strict rules from them as well as from your own institution. So be careful. For example, if it's a for-profit industry and they say they don't allow overhead, that's an absolute stop here at UCLA. They won't let you do that. That's like considered giving a gift to a business, which is something UCLA doesn't do. So take a look at that and understand that's going to shape whether or not you can even move forward at all. And it'll shape how much time you need to prepare your budgets. So let's say you figured out your sponsor. Oh, I have a question here. What happens if the sponsor has a cap on the indirect rate? Okay, so if that's the case, it needs to, we're going to get into that in a minute, but it needs to be a published policy that they apply to everybody. So there better not be on record that they let, UCSF charge 10% overhead, but now they're telling you they don't allow overhead at all, or they only allow 8% overhead. And your institution has to accept it. They might have to do some sort of paperwork to do like a exception of indirect cost rate. And it may or may not get approved. If it's a big, like RWJF or PCORI or one of those big nonprofits that we do stuff with all the time, they likely already have an exception on file and it's okay. But if it's not, if it's a smaller institution, you really want to make sure that you are allowed to proceed. Is a subaward the same as a subcontract? I went into detail on this in my fall one, and the answer is maybe. So subaward is the umbrella term that could include subcontracts as well as subgrants. A lot of people use the phrase subcontract as a catch-all for any subsite, but technically to be a subcontract, the main award has to be a contract and not a grant. And contracts have their own rules and everything. And so if you get a contract and then you issue some of that money to another site, that site is a subcontract. They're also a subaward. It's just a type of, what type of subaward is a subcontract. So hopefully that answers that question. All right. So sponsor guidelines. You figured out which sponsor you want to apply to. You've got an idea for the kind of research that you want to do. And now you are going to look at those guidelines and get a feel for what exactly you need to do. If you attended my fall session, I said there was one 3-word phrase that if you walk away from my course remembering nothing other than those 3 words, it were these 3 words. I would like to test you all by asking you to type into the chat if you remember that 3-word phrase that I repeated like about 7 million times in my fall session about sponsor guidelines. So let's see. Yes. Oh, Rachel, you get a gold star. Look at you. Read the guidelines. I am serious, you guys. There's so many people who don't do this, and it will come and bite you in the patootie if you don't. Read the guidelines. It is going to save you so much trouble. You are going to get insight into what exactly are they looking for. You're going to make sure that you haven't broken any of the rules. You're going to know exactly what format they're asking for. So many people start working on a project and they start developing like a really detailed line item budget. And then they read the guidelines and find out that the sponsor only wanted to know your total personnel and then everything that's not personnel. That's all they wanted to know. And now you've spent 4 weeks developing a detailed line item budget that you don't even need. And if you had read the guidelines, you would know. So please read the guidelines. Thank you. And you get a virtual lollipop. All right. So you are reading the guidelines. You are a good student. You listen to Laura. You know what you're doing. You've got those guidelines and you're reading them. What are you supposed to pay attention to? So these are the basics. I'm not going to go through all these line by line, but some of these are going to affect your budget. So you need to kind of pay attention to it. Obviously, the deadline, what does it do? That's really important. And does your project even fit what they're asking for, their mission? But things like the project period. Do they have a mandatory start date? Is that start date July 2024? That's over a year from now. Knowing that can affect your budget because now you're thinking, well, wait a minute. I'm due for a merit increase in, October. So when I budget, I shouldn't budget my current salary. I should budget what my salary will be come July 2024. Same thing with your staff. If you guys get, 2% cost of living increases every year, pre-escalate those salaries to that July 2024 rate. That's usually allowable. Is there a required template that they want you to use? Make sure you know what it is right from the beginning. And then when you're looking at those guidelines, you're going to want to pay attention to the budget sections, of course. And here are the things you want to look at. The required template and format. Often they will have a form that they want you to fill out. Sometimes they don't, and you can just use your own. But if they have one that they want, make sure that you are using it or that whatever budget you create can be transferred onto that form, that you're going to gather the specifics that they want to see on whatever form you're using. Pay attention to any maximums or any caps that they have listed. That includes salary cap. If you have a co-investigator who gets paid $300,000 a year, but there's a salary cap of $200,000, their base salary has to be $200,000. It doesn't matter what it is in real life. It is $200,000 on this budget. They might have a maximum on the amount of money you can ask for, but pay attention. Is it a maximum to the direct costs or is it a maximum to the total costs? Those of you with 60, 56% overhead rates, you're going to get screwed if that maximum is total cost, because now you're going to have a lot less money for your direct costs than that person who had 4% indirect cost rate. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. And then again, indirect costs, do they have a maximum on how much you're allowed to charge for indirect? And if so, how do you deal with that? Other things to take a look at are cost sharing. This is pretty rare, and be careful about it. Make sure that you're allowed to have a cost share. It basically says that your institution promises to dedicate X amount of money if this gets awarded. And there's extra documentation that goes along with that. Sometimes sponsors will have required items. They will say, you must budget $3,000 in year one for the mandatory meeting in Washington, D.C. for all awardees. Make sure you saw that. Make sure it got included. I have seen many people submit me a budget missing things that were explicitly stated on the guidelines. And I know they didn't read the guidelines. All right, unallowable expenses, same thing. They, sponsor hates airplanes. They are not going to fund travel in any way, shape, or form. Don't ask for it. Make sure you know what they don't want to see. And then take a look at their justification requirements. Usually they're going to ask for a detailed budget justification. But every now and then, especially with smaller nonprofits, they just want a couple of words or even maybe a sentence per line. It's built into their template, the justification. It's just a couple of words to give you a little bit more detail. If you read the guidelines, you'll know that you don't have to create this long 5-page document. Awesome. Make sure you find that out from the beginning rather than after the fact. So here's an example. I just went on Google and I searched RWJF funding opportunities, came up with this healthy eating research project that they are asking people to submit proposals for. Now, I see up at the top left here, these guidelines are 10 pages long. I could just Control F and find keyword budget to figure out what I need to know about the budget. But am I going to do that? No, because I'm going to read the guidelines. It's only 10 pages. You can do it. Read from beginning to end, because you are going to find information that is going to shape your budget that's not going to have the keyword budget next to it. So make sure you're reading it from start to finish. Let's say we do that. We mosey on down. You'll see the first incidence of the word budget isn't until page 5. If I had done that Control F, I would have missed out on 5 pages of glorious information that will help me get awarded. But now I'm here, I found the budget section, and what do I need to pay attention to? All right, I'm looking at it. It looks like they have a maximum 275,000. They don't say if this is direct cost or total cost. So that means it's total cost. Unless they state otherwise, it includes indirect costs. All right. If it didn't, they would say something. 24 months. All right. So it can't be more than 2 years. But this very next sentence tells you they'd really rather it not be that. A lot of people look at this and they say, okay, I'm going to do a 2-year study for 275. Don't do that unless you actually have a project whose scope mandates the full maximum allowable. You should just budget for what you actually need. The reviewers are going to look at that and say, this doesn't need to be a 2-year project. This can get accomplished in 1 year. Why did they ask for 2 years? And then you're not going to get it. They also have information about indirect costs. And then most importantly, oh my goodness, they refer me to a whole separate document that I need to go look at for details. And now I know that. So we're going to have another little test your skills moment here, and I'm going to open the floor for questions. But in the meantime, I want you to go online. If there's a sponsor opportunity that you are interested in, Google it. If not, come up with one randomly. See if you can find a request for applications or some sort of sponsor guidelines. Open it up and see if you can find some key points that would help you in creating your budget. And in the meantime, questions, feel free to unmute. I'm going to check the chat. I'm going to give everybody like another 60 seconds. All right, while you're doing that, again, you can keep taking a look at RFAs if you would like, and just listen out of one ear. I'm just going to go through a couple of common templates that you will see. Each sponsor has their own. This one is the NIH SF424. It's one of the most common ones. You'll see it for K awards, for R awards, etc. It's got multiple pages. This first page asks for key personnel separated by other personnel, and they want the base salary and the effort and the benefits. Page 2 would have things like travel. Page 3 would have things like materials and supplies and other costs. RWJF, looks like they separated out by personnel, other, and purchased services. So that's its own separate category, which also has its own separate rules. PCORI, pretty similar in terms of the way they separate it as NIH, but it's just organized in a different order. But they have the same salaries, consultants, equipment, etc. So each of these are going to be a little bit different depending on what you're applying for. But the main thing is that you're going to want to have something in Excel to help you. So if it's a PDF, you don't want to build your budget in there. That's where you put all your numbers after you figured it out. So you want to have some sort of Excel template yourself. And as I said earlier, don't reinvent the wheel. Check to see if one already exists. If it has enough detail, you can use the same template for any project. As long as you can extract whatever information you need and put it into the format that they want, you're good to go. So the more detailed your template is, the better, because you don't want a sponsor who wants more detail than what your template has. Now you got to create a new template. But if you have any baked in mandatory costs, like let's say rent, let's say for every percentage of rent, you have to charge $100 of rent or something, you should have a formula built in there. So as you change people's effort, it'll automatically change the rent, and you will know exactly how that affects your budget from the beginning. You don't have to create a new one for every grant that you make. I have some of my templates available on my website, which is the UCLA Department of Family Medicine Research Unit website. That will be on the last slide here under resources. You guys can feel free to pilfer mine and adjust it to your own needs. Let me just look at the questions to see. Okay. Yeah, some good points here. I will try to get to questions during the next break there. Okay, so the worksheet, see if you can find one that works for your institution, and then you can use that to translate into the templates that are required. All right, so we've gone through the idea phase. We've figured out the funding opportunities. We've read the guidelines, and we are now into the meat and potatoes. We're developing our proposal. Let's get into the nitty gritty. We're about halfway through, so we're right on time. This is the point where if you have a contract and grant expert or a pre-award person at your institution, this is when you want to get them on board. You have enough information now to go to them and say, here are these guidelines. I want to apply to this. I have an idea for my research, and I have an idea for who's going to be on my team, and maybe approximately how much effort they're going to dedicate. Can you help me? And this is when they're going to jump in. Now, this isn't to say that you can't create a budget on your own. That's why you're here, is to learn how to do it. But if you are, especially if you're an investigator, this is not going to be your job. No matter how budget literate you get, you are not going to be doing this full time. And it is their job. It's their job to know all the little exceptions and rules. And the sooner you get them involved, the sooner they can warn you about, oh, you're going to need to build in extra time to get this new form they just announced filled out, or whatever it is. So this, at this point in the process, is where you want to loop them in. Looping them in before you've even found the sponsor guidelines is a little bit too early. They don't know how to help you yet. They don't know what you're trying to do. They don't know what rules they have to follow. So this is where to do it. So personnel. All right. So cost sharing, I see a question about cost sharing. We'll try to get into that in a minute. So personnel is going to be the biggest component of most people's budget. NIH released some stats last year that said on average 80% of budgets went towards personnel. So we're going to spend quite a few slides talking about it because this is where most of the questions come from. There's different types of personnel. You've got your key, your other, and not all sponsors care. They just might put all the personnel into one. But if it's the NIH or the NSF, they are going to want you to separate out who's key and who's not. So in this case, I want to clarify that usually key personnel are PIs and co-Is. It rarely includes other titles, but it sometimes does, depends on your project. Usually, if they're key personnel, those are the ones that you have to provide a CV or a biosketch for. And if that person were to leave the project or significantly reduce their effort on the project, you would need to tell the sponsor and get their okay on it. So if you're not sure if somebody should be classified as key personnel or other personnel, you can ask yourself those last two questions. Would adding their biosketch make it more or less likely that this will be funded? If they left the project, could I just hire somebody else to replace them? Or would it significantly impact the scope and the expertise that our team has? If the answer is to like both of those are no, then there's probably other personnel. So you're going to want to think about that. Other personnel is basically anybody who's not key. You got your lab techs, your project coordinators, your research assistants. Every now and then your project director might be considered key personnel, but usually not. Postdocs and grad students usually are other, but there are some cases in which they are key personnel. Take a look at the sponsor guidelines. If you are including a graduate student researcher, be aware you also have to budget for tuition remission. And again, this is getting into the nitty gritty. You don't necessarily need to know exactly how much, but you should know that that's going to be a factor so that you can talk to your budget person or your pre-award expert and say, hey, I have a grad student. I know enough to know that that's going to affect my budget significantly. Can you help me with the details? So things that are going to be asked about on the personnel section of a budget, they're going to want to know their name and their role, their base salary and their effort. I do want to say, make sure that in the personnel section, you are not including consultants. You are not including subawards. They have to be an employee of your institution. If they are not, they go somewhere else on the budget. They can still be budgeted for, but not in the personnel section. Don't put them there. That's the wrong place. So they want to know the name, the role, their base salary, and how much effort are they dedicating. Effort can be in percentage or it can be in person months. I should have had a slide on person months, but we only have 90 minutes. But basically, if it's a 12-month project and you are a full-time yearly employee, all you have to do is take the percentage and times it by 12. So 10% is 1.2 calendar months. Where it gets tricky is two scenarios. One, your budget period is not a year. Let's say it's half a year and you're at half effort. So if it was a full, if it was 50% effort and it's a 12-month project, that's 6 months. But if it's 50% effort and it's a 6-month project, now it's 3 calendar months. And then the other example would be if you are not a 12-month employee, let's say you work in like non-medical fields and you are a teacher or something, and you have a 9-month appointment and summer salary is separated out into its own beast. Person months can get tricky in that particular case. So you're going to want to talk to your pre-award expert to figure out person months, or maybe I'll do a whole separate talk on that. Fringe benefit rates, I have the link here to the UCLA ones, but your institution will have set rates. It might be the same for all employees, or it could vary depending on that employee's title. So you've got to do a little bit of research or talk to your pre-award expert to find out. Things you want to think about are escalation. Is this a 5-year project? Maybe you want to build into it base salary escalation, maybe 1% a year, or maybe halfway through the project period, it goes up by 3%. It needs to be justified and it has to be allowable by the sponsor in order to do that. But assuming that it is allowable and it is justified, you're going to need to include it. Think about changes in effort across the budget period. Is this going to be a lot of work up front and then the project is going to peter out towards the end for that particular person? If so, their effort in year 1 should be more than it is in year 5. And then of course, salary caps, you have to include that as well. Here's an example. Oh, sorry, that's on the next page. Oh, I have a question here. How to budget if I anticipate a big jump of salary for the second year? Ooh, 20%. Oh, so that is going to be a huge red flag to the reviewer. So no, if you're talking about 20% effort change, that's fine. That is very easy to justify in your justification. You'll just have to explain the difference. Why is year 2 money, or why is the year 2 effort so much more than it was in year 1? It's because here are their responsibilities in year 2 that she couldn't do because there were no patients enrolled in year 1, for example. But if it's salary, then it's going to be a problem. So you might want to consider, depending on the start date, pre-escalating the salary just from the beginning. Pre-escalating it to what you think is going to be for the majority of the budget period. You can talk to your institution to make sure they allow it and read those guidelines to make sure that it's not unallowable. But if you have a reasonable expectation for somebody's salary to be something new, let's say they go from being a resident to faculty, for example, you can pre-escalate their salary to what their faculty level is going to be as long as you can justify it. So great question. So I get a lot of questions on how to estimate effort. How much effort do I dedicate to a project? It's a balancing act. You don't want to put too little, because if you do, you're not going to be able to achieve your scope. You might have hiring or retention issues because people are like, I'm not getting paid enough to do this. But you don't want to do too much either, because then your reviewer is going to say, are you kidding me? It does not take that much time to do what you are proposing. This PI has no idea what they're talking about. We should not award them the project at all. So you have to find that balance there. And how to do it, I wish I had an easy answer for you, but it's basically, you have to do the math. So take a look at your scope. Do a power study if you need to figure out exactly, how big your study needs to be, how many participants need to be involved to make it statistically significant. And then you're determining your individual roles and responsibilities, and you're looking at one person at a time. This is what I'm expecting them to do. How do I quantify that in terms of hours or days or weeks? So the questions you want to ask yourself are, how many hours would it take me to do that? Is it going to take that person less time because they're more senior than me? Is it going to take them more time because they're more junior than me? And then you just have to quantify it over the course of the project. Is it going to change in later years? If so, how? Take notes, write it all down, and then you have it added up. Like, all right, well, this looks like to be X number of hours, which is equivalent to X calendar months. I will say the more you do this, the easier it gets. At the beginning, you are going to be taking copious notes and figuring out and being really detailed. Eventually, you will get to a point where you can look at it at the roles and responsibilities and say 10% effort. And you don't have to do all that math. But until you get there, especially if you are a new investigator, put in the work. Talk to a colleague as well and say, this is what I'm thinking. Does it sound reasonable? If you're still really annoyed and you're like, look, I came to this talk so that I can learn exactly what to budget for in terms of effort, I will give you one more slide. But I will say there's no such thing as typical effort. It really depends on what you are proposing. But having said that disclaimer, let me give you some examples of typical effort. So if you are a new investigator, I would not put yourself on for less than 25%. So if you are a new investigator, you are the PI of the study, you should probably be 25 or more. But I wouldn't go under 25. That's going to be a little bit of a red flag for the reviewer. And then if you are going to be less than 25%, explain why. If it's a smaller, pilot or something, just make sure you're explaining why you can really do it for less than that. Mid or senior level investigators, I see some of these people, especially mid-level, that are still putting themselves on at 30-40% effort. And I'm like, look, you're advanced now. You don't need to be listing yourself for that high of effort on your project. At this point in your career, you should know how to do this with your eyes closed, or you should be able to do it faster, or you should have a team that's responsible for some of those more lower level tasks that maybe as a new investigator you were doing yourself, but now you got somebody else doing it. So it should be less as you get more advanced. If there's more than one PI and multiple PI, again, it'll be less than what you would have otherwise done because you're splitting the duties. There's some other examples here. K awards are an exception. That's an NIH award meant for junior investigators, and they want you to be at 75% or more. So for co-investigators on the study, usually the co-investigator will have less effort than the PI, usually. If the PI is a new PI, definitely. You do not want a new PI running a project with co-investigators that have more responsibilities than they do. That doesn't look good to a reviewer. If you are a senior PI, you might be able to get away with that. You might be able to get away with being PI on a project at 10%, but then having a co-investigator on for 20. It depends on what they're doing. And then for non-key personnel, this is really variable. And it's also really common for in between budget periods to vary drastically, depending on, what they're going to be responsible for. If you have a project director or a project coordinator, I'd be careful about doing weird percentages like 22.5% or something. That looks like you're just trying to cover their salary. And it also, if you have a project coordinator, but who's only dedicating 5% effort, that's not enough time to actually coordinate a project. So you're going to want to be careful on the title that you give them. A project director and a project coordinator should have a significant amount of effort on there. Depending on how senior they are, it might be less. For non-key personnel, it's better to overestimate than underestimate. And one of the reasons is because they tend to get paid less. And adding 5-10% effort to them is going to have a very small impact on your budget anyway. So might as well overestimate rather than underestimate. And it also allows you to maybe build in for a raise. So, all right, let's move on. Sample personnel budget, let's look at it. It is, this is one that I use. We've got Tony Stark and Bruce Banner over here are the investigators, and we've got their role, we've got their effort, we have what that means in calendar months, because depending on which sponsor it is that I'm using, I might need to do it in percent, might need to do it in calendar. You have their base salary. It looks like there's a salary cap here. And then the salary is about we're asking for based off of their effort times their base. That's the salary we're asking for. There's benefit rate. It depends on their title. And this is how much we're asking for fringe benefits. And then the total for year one that we're asking for. I summarized down to the bottom the total salary and the total benefits. Because if you have a sponsor who just wants to know the total salary rather than the individual line items, I now have it and can easily transfer that $130,000 figure into their form. Year two, it looks like we got some, you can change the effort here and everything else will change accordingly. Maybe you can change their base if somebody's due for a raise. So that's a basic one that if you had something like this, you will probably be able to use it for any sponsor's budget. All right, so I'm going to check the chat really quick to see if there's any questions that we can deal with. STTR, I actually, there's like small business and it's a specific type of NIH proposal. Possible to put PIs as without salary in order to funnel funds to another part of the project. It depends on the sponsor. So you can definitely put effort without pay if the sponsor allows it, and if the PI has funding from an unrestricted source. So this goes for co-investigators as well. If you want to put somebody on for effort, like 10% effort, but we're not asking for any money at all, we are going to pay it in kind. You have to make sure that they are getting paid from some sort of unrestricted source. If they're 100% contract and grant paid, they can't do that because now they're charging their time on your project to somebody else, and that's illegal. Can't do that. But assuming they have an unrestricted amount of effort and unrestricted source of funding for their effort, they are allowed to do that. Make sure you've read the guidelines to make sure it's okay. All right. So travel, another common one that you see in your proposals. Let's see, we've got most important thing, it has to be directly related to the project. I know this sounds funny. Of course it does. Everything has to be. But I'm serious. People will ask for money to go to a conference that has absolutely nothing to do with the project at hand. Don't be one of those people. Be aware that usually the sponsor is going to want to know the difference between study travel and conference travel. So study travel is like, traveling to meet with your co-investigators or traveling to clinics to enroll patients or whatever it is that's specific to the study. And then conference is going to be to disseminate research findings, etc. Often sponsors will want to have it separated by foreign and domestic. They may even also want local to be separated out. Local means within your city. Domestic is within your state or within your country. Expenses that you want to include. Gas and mileage. If it's local, people always think about mileage and gas, but they often forget about parking fees. So if you are sending, say, for example, your project coordinator every other week is going to 5 or 6 sites to do patient recruitment or whatever it is, you're paying for their mileage, but at each of these clinics, they have to pay $20 to park, which is what it's like here in LA. You're going to want to have budgeted for that because that is going to be a huge expense over the course of a year. So parking fees, airfare, everybody always remembers that, but they often forget ground transportation. How are you getting to the airport? Are you going to take a lift? You should be covered for that too. Lodging and hotel, you got to figure out how many nights you're going to be there. Meals, it's going to be, if you're there for 3 nights, you probably need 4 days of meals. If you're traveling to a country that requires a visa, you can budget for the cost of visa fees. And then, of course, conference registration. That's a big ticket item. People sometimes forget that, but some of these conferences, the registration is like $1,000. So make sure you have that on there as well. If you're not sure how much to budget for, say, lodging or meals, this link is going to be your best friend. It's going to take you to a website where you can literally type in Washington, D.C. in November, and it'll tell you what is the hotel rate that you should use and what is the meal rate. That doesn't mean you're going to get paid this if you travel there. You're going to get paid whatever you actually spent when you do the travel, but this will help you budget it. So that's a great way to do it. This is what mine looks like. I will have all of those items on an individual line. I will estimate the cost based off of, that website that I just went to, depending on what city I'm going to. How many people are you sending on the trip? How many meetings per year are they going to do? The quantity per trip, like registration, you only need to do that once, but hotel, 4 nights, if it's, a 4-day event or something. Ground transportation, I have 4 because you got to go to and from the airport on both ends. Your local travel, usually your institution will have a gas mileage reimbursement amount. Figure out what it is. That's how you sort it. And then you've got your total travel amount. So this is how I would do it. And again, this is available on my website if you don't want to reinvent the wheel. Okay, it seems foreign travel is not included in budget for most grant applications. How to justify to include. All right, so again, you're going to need to look at the guidelines to make sure it's allowable. The NIH does allow it, but they want you to separate it out, and then you have to justify it. A lot of times it's because, let's say, you're going to the International AIDS Conference, and every other year it's in Canada or it's in Europe or something. So you would just explain, hey, the 2025 International AIDS Conference is being held in Beijing. That's why we're going to Beijing. If it's for study travel, it's usually going to be very clearly stated that that's allowable because they want to do international study work. If they're not clear that they want international study work to occur, this might not be the right sponsor opportunity for you. So something to think about. All right, materials and supplies. If it's less than 1,000, you typically don't need to itemize it. But you have to provide some sort of general explanation for it. Individual supplies that you do want to itemize would probably be things like computers. Let's say at the beginning of the project, you know you're going to hire a new research coordinator and you need to get them a computer. That's something you can individually itemize in your section. Or if you need to buy a bunch of tablets so that participants can complete a survey in the clinic waiting room or something like that. That's a big ticket item that you can itemize. But for the most part, you can lump these into one section. But what I want to warn you against is don't use the term general or office or general office supplies. That's a huge flag. Remember we talked about indirect costs? That's the sort of thing that sponsors assume your indirect costs cover. So then why are you buying paper and pens and printer ink? That's a general, expected cost to run an institution. Why are you asking me to provide that? And if you listed it in your justification as general office supplies like paper, they're going to say no, and they're going to cut it from the budget or they're not going to award it. So instead, say project specific supplies. That is allowable. It could be the same thing. It could still be paper and printer ink, but now it's project specific. Maybe you have to print up a bunch of questionnaires to distribute at clinics. That makes sense. You're going to need the paper and the ink to do that. It's project specific, but now you've explained that instead of just making it sound like, regular day-to-day type stuff. If you don't have a specific explanation, like, printer ink and paper to print up 5,000 questionnaires, you can use more generalized language. Feel free to steal this one here that I put. This is what I put on most of my stuff. This is my catch-all. This is I know I'll probably need some sort of materials, but I can't necessarily off the top of my head list each and every one. If I have this phrase in my budget and I get this award, and now I need to buy, I don't know, a flash drive to save my talk. So when I go to that International AIDS conference, I can present my talk, but I need to buy a flash drive. I didn't budget for it anywhere. I can't buy it. But if I had this line here about project specific supplies, that falls under that. I'm good to go. So that's a good one. Screenshot that if you haven't already. All right, so equipment. This is different from material and supplies. People always confuse this. It has to be more, for the most part, depending on your institution or the sponsor, but for most people, including the feds, it has to be more than $5,000 per unit to be considered equipment. So your laptop computer, that's not equipment. That goes into materials and supplies. A supercomputer? Yeah, okay, that would be considered equipment. If you are going to budget for this, I highly, highly recommend that you get quotes and that you include that in your justification. You don't have to attach the quote, but you should explain that you did get quotes and this was the best price, or that the average price was X, which is why you're asking for that. For the most part, equipment is exempt from overhead. It's one of those modifications to the direct cost total. So keep in mind. All right, participant incentives. Let's say you got some participants and you want to pay them for their time. If it's human subjects research, you're going to need to get IRB approval. Just have that in mind. And if that's the case, they're going to need to approve the amount that you have allocated. So it should be enough to incentivize, but not enough to coerce. Again, would a jury of your peers assume that to be a reasonable amount? You don't want it to be so much that somebody who would have otherwise said, no, I'm not comfortable doing this study, might do it anyway just because they need the money. If that's the case, that's too much. That's considered coercion. Your IRB will probably not allow for it. And the sponsors will probably be upset about it. You don't want it to be too little either. $5 doesn't go as far as it used to. So a $5 gift card is not going to incentivize most people to do something unless it's really, really easy. Depending on your participant population, you may also want to consider including money for transportation or even food. If it's an indigent population or people experiencing homelessness and you need them to come in person, having a Lyft come pick them up is a great way to make sure that they don't miss their study visit. And you're going to want to have the money to afford that. Be aware that if you have incentives, especially if it's for a large number of participants, you got to budget for administrative time too, whether it's the investigators or project coordinators. There's a lot of documentation that goes along with this kind of coordination. Don't underestimate it. Here's an example of mine. In this case, the type of visit will have a different dollar amount associated with it. The very last one is the biggest to incentivize them to come. I allowed for a 10% attrition rate. And it basically just helps you organize how much am I asking for. You can set it up like this. You can have a different one for each year of the study or one for the entire study period, and then split it amongst the years, whatever works for you. If you have participants, there's something more than just incentives that you should think about. How are you going to get participants? Do you need a budget for recruitment? Maybe you need to pay for some ads on Facebook or Instagram or something. So budget for that as well. That's usually allowable. Check the guidelines and you'll know. Does your IRB charge a fee? If so, you can budget for that. Are you going to need to translate your recruitment documents or your informed consents into other languages? That's going to cost money. How are you going to communicate to your participants? Do you need a 1-800 phone number? You can get one, but you have to pay for it. Do you need to buy a cell phone for your project coordinator? So all of the, so she can answer them even if she's out on the road. Are you going to be sending out mailed questionnaires? If so, you got a budget for envelopes and postage. If you're going to be doing focus groups, do you need to rent a space to do that? Are you going to have food during those meetings? Do you need to transcribe the interviews after the fact? So these are all things you can think about. And then what are the costs associated with it? You can get quotes. You can reach out to colleagues and say, hey, you had to translate your informed consent. How much did that end up costing you? And then you can use that as your baseline. You can talk to your expert to get a feel for it. But at least this way, you know that you need a budget for it. Okay, we're running a little bit behind. I got to go faster. Publication costs. So this is, it could be for printing up a poster, journal publication fees. Usually they happen later in the study because you're not going to have much to publish in the first year. Maybe you do, though. I do want to point out that there's a new data management and sharing policy that the NIH requires, and you have to have a whole separate line item explaining how are you going to manage your data, and you are allowed to budget for it. You're also allowed to budget for the personnel costs associated with it. They want those personnel costs to be included in the data management line. They don't want you to lump it into the personnel section. They want you to separate any effort required to de-identify data or whatnot into this line. So you can take a look at these slides for more details later because I got to rush a little bit here. Are mailing costs under indirect costs for UCLA? No, it is not. We have to pay to mail things. If you're mailing something within the university, that's free. It's campus mail. But if you're sending anything out, you need to buy stamps. I know of no department that will pay for stamps out of pocket. They're going to make you pay for that out of your project budget. So, good question. All right. Check with your institution about this one. At UCLA, we have 3 that I know of if you're off campus, 2 if you're on campus. It's technology infrastructure fee, TIF, that pays for our network backbone, computers and Wi-Fi and whatnot, and then our general liability or GALE, which is directly tied to effort and it's or tied to salary, and it's sometimes required depending on the sponsor. If it's federal, you don't need to include it. If it's anybody else, you do for the most part. Your institution probably has some, and they're probably mandatory. Hopefully they're not massive. Oh, and if you're off campus, rent is the third one. So find out what it is so that you can allow for it. Know that they exist so that if you spend a lot of time, like let's say there's a $50,000 max, and you spend all this time and you got it up to $49,999, and you submit it to your expert, and then like, oh, but you didn't include TIF and GALE. All your time has been wasted now. But if you had known to allow for that, maybe you wouldn't have spent so much time getting it down to the dollar. So just keep it in mind, even if you don't know all the rules. Consultants. Okay, so we had talked a little bit about this earlier. Again, they're providing advice, but they're not involved in making decisions. If that is one of them, be aware that they can't be employees. You can't pay an employee of your own institution to serve as a consultant, because now they're getting paid on the side. And were they moonlighting for somebody who works in their same institution? It's tricky. Most institutions do not allow for that. They're also not considered key personnel. So if you really want to include their bio sketch and all of that, don't list them as a consultant and put them on as a subaward. There's going to be a fixed rate. It's either per hour or per milestone, maybe per day. Check the guidelines, read the guidelines to see, is there a rate limit? There might be. They are not subject to salary caps, but there might be a rate limit. And you do have to make sure it meets the definition of reasonableness, which they don't define. So just use your best judgment. If you're worried about it, explain it in the justification. Usually in the justification, they just want to know the rate. But if you are also going to cover the travel, the consultant's travel, you need to justify that separately. It's still the same line item, but include in the justification, X dollars per hour for this number of hours, plus $5,000 to travel, and why are they traveling? Subawards, we talked about this before, but they each need to have their own mini proposal. So they need to have their own budget, their own justification, their own scope of work, and it has to all be approved by their office. They're basically proposing, they're creating their own proposal and sending it to us as a sponsor. Then we take that, loop it in with ours, and now we submit both of them to the prime sponsor. I get asked questions a lot of like, do I just give my subawards free rein to determine their own budget? Not usually. Maybe. It depends on your relationship with your co-investigator. Usually you'll give them a maximum, or you'll tell them the ballpark, or you'll say, I can cover 10% of your effort and 50% of a research assistant. If you have multiple subawards that are all doing the same thing, be careful about giving them the same dollar amount. A sub-site in the heart of Hollywood is going to have different costs than a sub-site in rural Mississippi. And so giving both of them $50,000 isn't really equitable in the long run, but saying you'll support 50% of a research assistant at each is equitable, and it'll probably be a lower dollar amount in Mississippi than it was in Hollywood. Each subaward needs to have a lead investigator. Especially if you have more than one co-investigator at that site, one of them's got to be in charge, if for no other reason than to accept the award and distribute it to everybody else. Indirect costs. Again, they have to charge indirect costs on their end. So following their institutional guidelines and the sponsor guidelines, their entire budget, or the modified amount of their budget, incurs indirect. But on top of that, in addition to that, we incur overhead on theirs as well. Most institutions have a rule that says up to the first 25,000, we're allowed to incur indirect costs on. So, because we have to set up the subaward, we have to manage all of their monthly invoicing and pay them, it takes effort. And so we're allowed to charge overhead on that up to the first 25,000. If you're looking at that and you're like, oh my God, I don't understand this at all, that's okay. That's why we brought in that expert earlier. That's their job. They're going to be able to figure it out like that. Get them involved. Just be aware that that exists, and don't worry about the details if it's complicated for you. I'm rushing, guys, because I only have 6 minutes left. All right, other considerations. If you have more than 1 year, how's it going to change over the year? Round to the nearest dollar. Unless they say otherwise in the guidelines, start from the beginning, rounding to the nearest dollar, especially if you're one of those PIs that likes to budget the absolute maximum. If you rounded wrong, your entire proposal will be unallowable because you went over by $1 if you rounded wrong. So round to the nearest dollar on each line so that your totals are also absolutely correct and not off by $1 here, $1 there. Don't stress too much in general unless it says otherwise in the guidelines. Sponsors allow you to rebudget within categories. So if you overspend, travel, and you just underspend supplies and it all balances out in the end, you're okay for the most part. So don't overly stress it. So let's say you've done all that and now you're over budget and you're like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I recommend starting trimming all the lines that can afford it just a little bit. Does that get you to where you need? If not, look at effort. That's the biggest part of your project. In particular, look at your PI and co-I investigators because they get paid more. So making a slight change there will help a lot more than making a big change elsewhere. If you're still over budget, you got to go back to your scope and say, is this the right funding opportunity for me? Maybe instead of 4 specific aims, I should just go for 2 specific aims. I just can't make it work here. Budget justification. So this is your narrative explanation, explaining exactly why you're asking for what you're asking and proving the reasonableness. I recommend, if they don't have a template that they want you to use, organize it in the same way as the budget was. So look at their budget template and use the same titles that they have in the same order that they have. That's what the sponsor wants to see. Make it easy on them. Again, if it's less than 1,000, keep it simple. But if there's anything weird or really expensive, this is your chance to prove that you are not a scam artist and that you have a really good reason for why you're asking for it. And of course, make sure your figures match. I like to do my budget justification last, because if you're fiddling with the numbers to make it work, you don't want to have to rewrite your budget justification every time you do it. This is my rule here. If your budget were to be published in the LA Times, would you embarrass yourself or the institution? If so, don't include it. Or make sure your justification really, really explains it so that somebody understands why you're asking for that. All right, so the last couple of minutes here, I'm just going to have a couple of sample justification blurbs up here, and I want you to see what's wrong with them, and then I'll open the floor for questions. So, and this one here, we've got Peter Parker. He's going to be doing these things, and he's budgeted for 9 months in year 1 and 2, and 3 months in year 3. What's wrong with this? There's a couple of things wrong with this. One, they didn't tell us what his role is. Is he the principal investigator? Like, who is he? What's his role? And second of all, why is it 75% and then it goes down to 25%? What happened in year 3? Don't leave your sponsors or your reviewers asking these questions. Write it out, explain it. He's the research assistant. Oh, okay, all right. And you know, he's doing all this participant related stuff in year 1 because that's what phase 1 is. After that's over, he's only going to be doing those things. Okay, now I understand as a reviewer why year 3 he's got hardly any effort at all. This one here, Tony Stark, they tell you he's going to serve as a PI, so they told us the role. And they told us how great he is and why he would be a great PI, and that he's budgeted for 1.8 calendar months. What they failed to tell you is, what is he doing on this study? Yeah, he could be the greatest. He's Iron Man. He's amazing. But what is he doing on this study? Why is it 1.8 calendar months? What are his roles and responsibilities? List them out. Don't make them do the work. Don't make them go back to your scope of work to try to figure out what he's going to be responsible for. Let him know, especially if you have more than one PI or if you have a lot of investigators. You have to explain what each of them are doing on the study and why you need so many. Last one, budget here for travel. We budget 10,000 for travel related expenses to attend 2 conferences annually. So what's wrong with this one is, oh my God, are you going to the moon? Why do you need $10,000 for 2? If you had done a detailed breakdown, you would see, even if these were almost week-long, 5-day conferences, it still would not be 10,000 a year. It would be 4,000 a year. So you're going to want to, you don't necessarily have to include this table if you don't want. I do, just because I went through the work of creating it, might as well include the detail. You don't have to, but you do need to say, what is it going to cover? Is it covering just airfare and hotel, or are you going to cover registration and ground transportation, etc.? If you know where you're traveling, say that too, so that they understand you're going all the way across the country. That's why, you know, you need $275 for airfare rather than $90 to go to, you know, Fresno. All right, so I know this is a lot of information. There are going to be some resources available when we send this out. Don't forget, Google is your friend. If you ever have questions on it, you can also email me. I am now going to open up the chat, and feel free to unmute as well so that we can get a couple of questions in. I show we have 1 minute, but I can stay later if anybody else wants to stay as well. All right, let's look for some questions here. For an R1, what is a reasonable amount for publication costs? That's a really good question. I have seen it vary. from usually I would not ask for less than a couple $100 at the bottom end, but I have seen it as much as 12,000 and maybe even more. But it depends, because one of the deliverables for this R01 was like a brochure that needed to be professionally designed and printed in color. And so they had a lot more publication costs than might have otherwise seen. On average, a couple thousand per year is what I usually see. But with the new data management and sharing, that could vary. And you might have some under publications and some under the data management line. And there might be overlap in between the two. For NIH, do you need to include biosketches for vendors or consultants? No, in fact, you're not allowed to. So only key personnel are you allowed to have a biosketch for. So if you have somebody who's really amazing that has agreed to be like a consultant on your project, be careful, because now you can't include their biosketch to show how amazing they are, because they're consultants and there's not even a place on the form to attach a biosketch. You might want to think about having them on as a, key personnel co-investigator, as a sub-award rather than a consultant, if warranted. Should sub-award justifications be a complete separate document from the main? Yes, fabulous question. They have their own separate justification, and it is just as detailed as yours will be. Detailed personnel breakdown, unless it's like a modular budget or something. But assuming it's not, it's going to be a detailed justification, showing their indirect cost breakdown, their travel, their supplies, all of that. It's going to be a separate document. In your main document, you're just going to summarize, we have 3 subawards, UCSF and Duke and Harvard, totaling X dollars for them, X dollars for them, and X dollars for them. Details can be found on their individual budget justifications. And then the reviewer will go to their individual justifications to get the nitty-gritty. But yeah, you would normally just summarize who and how much, and then refer them to that other one. Anybody who wants to unmute, I'm going to stop sharing. Do you see any hands raised or anything, Elena or Enrique? Did I miss any other questions? If not, thank you so much. We will be sending out slides. There's also going to be an evaluation sent. I would really appreciate it if you filled it out. It helps me do better next time. And it helps, boost my ego. So yeah, if you do get a chance to fill that out, thank you so much. These slides will be made available, and I do appreciate everybody joining us today. Thank you. I'll stay on for a few more minutes to answer questions.